Thank you so much, Jason. Hi, everyone. I am Vishakha. Just want to make sure I'm audible. Jason, can you tell me if you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm Vishakha Ghosh, and I will be your presenter for today, and I am going to take you through some best practices for successful deployment of Defender for IoT. So my role with Microsoft is I am a customer experience engineer for the Defender for IoT team, and I work with customers to ensure that they are successful in their rollout, deployment, implementation of Defender for IoT, as well as their overall OT ICS security posture. And all this by utilizing the many capabilities that our product has to offer. So this webinar session is largely going to be focused on the successful deployment stages and what that is going to look like. But I'm also going to start by touching a little bit about what Defender for IoT is from a product standpoint, for those of you who aren't aware and don't know much about the product. And then I'm going to close off with some Microsoft recommended tips and tricks for success. All right, so what is Defender for IoT? Let's take a look. So Defender for IoT is a security solution which is specifically built for the IoT OT environment. It is absolutely on-premise to keep in mind the nature of IoT OT devices in the industry right now, which is largely unmanaged and air-gapped. It is agentless, meaning there is nothing installed to your network components or onto your network. It is absolutely passive, as in it does not cause any interruptions actively to the network, and it doesn't perform any kind of active scanning. It is also designed to perform continuous monitoring. So a little bit about how it works. So the way our Defender for IoT sensor would work is that it would receive a mirrored copy of the traffic from the switch that it is connected to, which is always a switch that is receiving most of the OT traffic, and it performs something called device discovery on it via deep packet inspection. And it uses that to identify the IoT and OT devices in that specific site by examining the traffic. It identifies their protocols, communication behavior, machine-to-machine behavior, identifies subnets that they're communicating in, and some important information like vendor, make, model, etc. It subsequently uses that to assess risks and vulnerabilities in the environment, and also to detect the threats and respond to those. Now, all this is managed through the sensor GUI. So our sensor has a GUI, and we can use that to manage manage our OT devices from a visibility standpoint. And by connecting the sensor to Azure, customers can take advantage of the full cloud-powered security value, as well as integration with other security products. And also, we use Azure to largely manage our sensors from a singular standpoint. Okay, so not only does our Microsoft Defender for IoT solution connect to Azure, it also is a part of Microsoft's overall security product family to complete the holistic XDR solution picture. It connects up to Sentinel the same way Microsoft Defender would, making Sentinel the single pane of glass from a SOC perspective. And that's what we aim to do. We want to break silos between handling IT security and OT security from a SOC standpoint, and we want to connect up all our security recommendations in one singular location. And also, we have the ability to connect to multi-cloud from the same space, and also to third-party log aggregation SIM platforms. Okay, so moving on to the good stuff, let's talk about how to deploy this. But before we do that, I just want to talk about how our sensor would connect up to a customer's network. To simplify the whole picture, it's just going to be two connections. Now we can see from this picture that the sensor connects to a switch that receives most of the OT ICS traffic, if not all, from our customer's environment. And the way the sensor gets the traffic is by creating a span, an ER span or a tap, depending on what the customer's preference is, on the OT switch. So that's one connection. And the second connection we make is to the management port of the sensor, which would connect to the management network. And the reason why we do that is because we would use that connection to bring up the sensor GUI and subsequently connect it to Azure. Now, after connection to Azure, obviously the customer has the full capability to connect it up to any kind of SIM of their choice, Sentinel or other examples. Now, having said that, I just want to re-emphasize the fact that the sensor is not in line with the traffic in any way or form, and it uses only one directional copy of the traffic. So there is no way to interrupt or cause any production impact, which results in zero production downtime, fast rollout, which makes the solution very easy to adopt. Okay, so when we talk about deployment strategy, I want to break it up into three major chunks. The plan and prepare stage. Plan and prepare stage is where all the scoping, all reviews, design reviews, meetings, communications is taking place, which is very, very important. We prepare the site from a networking standpoint to be able to receive and start using our sensor. Then we move on to the deployment stage, which technically takes a little bit of time, because here's when we are configuring and customizing the solution specifically to the customer's needs. And then we use this. So in the deployment stage is when we create the baseline, and we create it so that we can get to a position where we've identified a use case and we are ready to hand off to SOC for security operations. Now, I want to do a deep dive into what each of these phases would look like from a customer standpoint, and I would do that for the rest of the presentation. So first, we have the plan phase. Let's break up plan and prepare further down. We have the plan phase. Now, we want our customers to think of the plan phase as the discovery phase. So in this phase is when most of the network architecture reviews would happen. We would take a network diagram, review it, see what OT subnets there are, find the specific location to where the sensor would be connected to. This is also the place from a customer standpoint where they decide what sites do they want to deploy first, prioritize the sites in terms of which are their crown jewels, which one is a good site to do a pilot or do a first deployment. And then once they've done that, that is when we talk about sizing the site, quote unquote, sizing the site. What I mean by sizing the site is identifying the throughput of the site. What kind of bandwidth are we looking at? How many devices are we looking at? And that will take us to deciding what kind of sensor we would have. And then after we've done that, we talk about what network changes will need to be made and who will make them. What actions need to take place from the change management request perspective, and we plan and prepare for lead times for that. So all that should happen in the planning phase. Now moving on to the preparation phase. Preparation phase is when we want our customers to think about how they would prepare the site to receive the sensor. Or in other words, the sensor type or the sensor profile that they identified in the planning phase. I'm going to talk more about sensor profiles in the next few minutes. So the sensor profile they identified, the ordering of that happens in the preparation phase. Configuration of the span, configuration of the tap, creating the firewall rules for access to the sensor as well as to Azure, allowing for cloud connection, making the necessary changes. And also at this point is when the customer would get ready to onboard the Defender for IoT solution on Azure as well as M365 for adding the plan and creating their license, creating subscriptions, accounts, etc. Deployment phase is the time when we are talking about installation of the sensor software onto the hardware that they ordered and received in the preparation phase. And yes, install the software, bring up the GUI, look at your traffic, try to get a feel of how do you use the GUI, customization, etc. Hygiene is tuning, customization, configuration, making it specific to the customer's needs, where we look at the type of traffic. We try to look if we are getting unicast broadcast traffic, if you're able to see all the protocols. We configure DHCP, we configure certificates for secure communication, etc. We also configure users in this stage. So the hygiene and tuning, this lasts typically about 3 to 4 weeks, and this is per site. And then after that, we create something called a baseline in conjunction with the customer. So both of us agree that, okay, the baseline has been created, and then you pass it off to SOC, and then you repeat the whole process. Okay, so now I'm going to zoom into each of the phases, and I am going to highlight some of the important decisions or important tasks that need to happen in each of these phases. So in the plan phase, it's important. So now is when it's important for customers to have some understanding of their overall OT network by performing network diagram reviews. You find the site of your choice where you would want to do the first deployment, and then try to estimate the size of the site. Estimate the number of assets that will be monitored, and that will help us determine what kind of sensor model they would need. In addition to that, once the sensor model decision has been made, the next thing that they need to focus on is determine the subnets and the VLANs that will be monitored. And in order to do that, we also need to identify the switch that the sensor will connect to. So the most important questions that we see customers asking themselves is, when they're trying to identify the right switch, is, will we see PLC and HMI communication if we connect to the switch? And if the answer is yes, that is the switch you connect to. So 3 important things in the plan phase: network diagram review to identify the switch, determine the subnets and VLANs that you need to monitor, and decide on the type of sensor you would need based on the size of the site for plan phase. Okay, so I know I mentioned about where you connect the sensor. I'm just going to quickly show via a diagram what I meant by that. So typically our sensors are placed in the network at the boundary of IT and OT. That's like the thumb rule of identifying where to place it. So on the Purdue model, what I mean is it's technically between layers 2 and 3 of the Purdue model, or between 3 and 3.5 if 3.5 is the industrial DNZ. The goal is to be able to see most, if not all, of the OT traffic, and that is the strategic place to place your sensor. Typically, we see 1 sensor per site, but there is always exceptions to the rule. We can accommodate if there needs to be more than 1 sensor in 1 site. Okay, Moving on to how to decide what profile of sensor you need. So we accommodate all different kinds and types of sites for our customers. We for IT and OT mixed environment where the bandwidth is typically high, which technically maps to 12K and about 12K maximum monitored asset, then this would be the hardware profile. And subsequently for enterprise monitoring at a site level and in production line, we have different hardware models that we would accommodate. I know this is a bunch of numbers. The next slide will look more visual. Okay, so there's two options for customers who would like to opt for a hardware sensor. The first option is the more recommended option to go is because Microsoft has a hardware partner, Arrow Electronics, that will ship pre-configured appliances directly to the customer site. So in this option, the customer doesn't really have to worry anything about the sensor software install or configuration. Arrow will take care of it. So these are examples of the different sensor profiles we have. So we partner with two hardware vendors, Dell and HPE, and we have options depending upon the need of the site. So if a customer determines their site to be receiving a maximum bandwidth of 1 Gbps and the maximum number of devices is 10K, then HP Pro, so they have a couple options. Hardware profile will be E1800, and they have an option of picking between the HPE and the Dell PowerEdge. And accordingly, they would plan for the physical specifications at their site. So this is a guideline on how a decision for the hardware sensor specifically would be made. Option 2, for customers who either have their own hardware partner or would just like to bring their own hardware, that is totally fine as well. We do accommodate that. Only recommendation we have is get the right bill of material from our official documentation, provide it to your hardware vendor, and that will help you get the right hardware that can support the Defender for IoT software on it. Okay, so for cases where the customer would like to go the VM route and would like to avoid all hardware, that is absolutely fine too. We also accommodate that. So the selection process is the same. So you look at the bandwidth and the maximum monitored asset, and that will give you the specifications for the VM provisioning. Moving on to the next phase, site networking setup. So in the preparation phase, I would like to highlight the items or actions the customer has to keep in mind when getting the site ready from a networking standpoint. So I just talked about identifying the right hardware or VM from a sensor perspective. In the preparation stage is where you perform the action of actually putting in the purchase order and ordering the hardware. I would like to emphasize that this is something that should be done as early in the process as possible so that we can avoid all kinds of unforeseen supply chain delays. And if the customer wants to go the VM route, then here's where they plan for allocating all the resources for the VM. Configuration of the span and tap, I've mentioned this before, so here's where you identify the switch and how you would want to span it, and where the sensor would connect, what port. That's from a mirroring standpoint. Now from a management standpoint, allocation of the management network parameters also need to happen here. So we provide a static IP for management, and we provide a default gateway and optionally a DNS. So that is easy to remember how to get to your sensor. So that is the IP or the address with which you would pull up your sensor GUI on the browser. So besides the GUI, we also have CLI to access the sensor. So connection to that needs to also be allowed. The right ports need to be open for SSH and for accessing the sensor to the web. So HTTPS also needs to be allowed. So the decision for connectivity of the sensor to the cloud is also something that should be taken into consideration in the preparation phase itself. So there is a few methods to connect to Azure, either direct or through a proxy or via multi-cloud, but that decision should be made at this point. And then also set up your certificates for secure access to the internet. So these are some important points to be kept in mind for the prepare phase. Okay, so onboarding phase. So that comes, it is a part of the prepare phase, but this should be done before we technically start deploying and tuning. So onboarding phase, there have to be certain actions that need to happen on the Microsoft 365 portal, whereas some need to happen on the Azure portal. So from on the Microsoft 365 is where you create a tenant if you don't already have one. And then the permission levels is global or billing. And you set up your trial license on that. So that's where, so M365 is where we set up our license for Defender for IoT. On Azure, we create an account, and the permission levels we need is either security admin, contributor, or owner, depending on the permissions that the customer needs for doing their various tasks. Onboard the sensor to Azure so that we can download what is called the activation file, and we need that activation file to connect the sensor individually to get it talking to Azure. And lastly, download the endpoint details. There is step-by-step documentation for that, so don't worry if you don't know where to find this. So download the endpoint details and make sure HTTP traffic is enabled over port 443 on the endpoints that are listed on that file. Okay, so deployment, again, those customers who order with our hardware partner, they do not have to worry about this step at all. They just have to connect the sensor to the span once it arrives to their site. But for those of you who want to DIY their sensor, like bring your own hardware, that's totally fine as well, because we have a detailed step-by-step installation guide available on our official documentation site, which the customers can look at. So I'm not going to spend too much time in the deployment. I am going to move on to what happens post-deployment. So yeah, so at the end of the deployment phase, the customers will be asked to provide an IP for management, a static IP for management, where that what they would use to typically bring up the sensor GUI over the internet. And yeah, and then they sign in with their credentials, and they can start using the sensor. So this is a snapshot of the overview page of the GUI. So as soon as the sensor is connected, the customer can see all the valuable information like packets per second that's coming in real time, number of devices that the sensor sees based on the mirror traffic, and also alerts right there. And browsing, like scrolling through each of these options, I'm not going to go too deep into that, but customers can start actually getting real value. Like they can see a device in inventory populated with detailed information about communication protocols, vendors, model. They can get a map view of their site, of the devices in their site, unicast, broadcast communication, alerts, etc. An important thing to do at this point is also to configure users. configure local users for the sensor if that's the route to go, or sync with Active Directory. So an important first step after you start using the sensor, after you have the sensor GUI up, is configuring local subnets and configuring DHCP address ranges. So here's where the customization starts. So our OT network sensor automatically learns the subnet in the customer's network. But however, we still recommend confirming those and updating them when needed so that their device map views and inventory is optimized for their view. And any subnets that are not listed as subnets will be treated as external networks. We've also seen situations where customers like to use an external IP address as an internal subnet, which is actually allocated to actual devices. But our system will default to thinking that to be external. So if that is the case for you as a customer, then we really recommend that you define it in the subnets. Also, if there are devices in the network that are configured to receive DHCP addresses, then it's important to mention it in the DHCP address ranges so that our sensor is not creating a lot of alert noise unnecessarily. Okay, so these are some important things to keep in mind when you start deployment. So moving on to the next phase, where I'm going to talk about some tips and tricks for success. Firstly, it's important before you even start deploying to identify a task list and identify the right stakeholders. So any customer that does this well is definitely set up for success. What is most important in this step is it allows the customer to take a step back and think about who needs to own what part of the deployment, who needs to give their buy-in, and who needs to actually perform the task. So for example, in the very first task where you identify the solution infrastructure, right? So this phase needs to happen in collaboration with the network architect who typically needs to own this, and in collaboration with the OT site engineers as well. And then when you go to the phase where you're trying to onboard sensors to Azure, then you have to work with somebody who has the right accesses, like Azure account admin or security admin, the person who will be managing the sensors from an Azure standpoint, right? So this helps the customer to identify who all the stakeholders are and work together. So working together helps with the success of this deployment. And yes, and at the end, when the baselining ends and they're ready to hand it off to security operations, then obviously the SOC analyst needs to come into the picture and identifies what they are seeing, why, and where. Okay. Now, some other tips for the initial plan and prepare stage is always identify and plan for your challenges, plan for lead times, plan for unforeseen hardware supply chain delays. So always have a plan B in place in case the hardware doesn't arrive on time. That is the most important, like typical challenge to plan for. Other than that, another recommendation we always provide to our customers is keep an active pre-production lab environment where they can validate and try out all the new features and capabilities that we have before you deploy it in production. So it's always good practice to test before deploying directly in production. And also, if customers are planning to do any kind of integrations to either third parties or any other kind of technology integrations, then do plan for lead times for that. Other than that, I mentioned in the previous slide, identify your key people, even if they're global, and work together, and also work on receiving the right training. We have a lot of training available on our knowledge share. I know Jason mentioned communities. I'm going to talk about that too. And yeah, get the right knowledge, get the right training. We are there to support from a Microsoft standpoint. Yes, and predefined OKRs, set up a task list that I mentioned before, and then have regular communication to track them. These are some tips for success. Okay, so in the deployment phase, during deployment or post-deployment, our sensor basically sits at the customer site. So our customers, quote unquote, own the sensor. So there are a few things that we recommend that our customers keep in mind in order to keep their software current. One of the most important thing is plan to update your sensor to the latest version at least every 6 months. So the official Microsoft nomenclature for our software versions is year.quarterly major.monthly minor. So this naming convention is going to help customers to identify where they are in terms of versioning with what's being currently released. And yeah, so we invest a lot in enhancement of the SaaS software continuously and on a regular basis. So customers are encouraged to update their version to take advantage of all the enhancements that we have to offer. Other than that, patching and bug fixes is also something we do. So that's also supported. And so every version is in support for 1 year from the time of release. And threat intelligence updates are continuously available, and that is independent of the sensor version. So from Azure, customers can take advantage of the threat intel updates. From a hardware standpoint, again, I would repeat, it's recommended to work with Arrow because their hardware is certified with the Defender for IoT software, which will lead to more supportability and shortened lead time. Now, I know I've talked about choosing your hardware profile based on the throughput, the span throughput of the site, which in other words is the bandwidth and the total number of devices. But we would still recommend our customers to keep in mind other factors that affect the performance, like network activity size, capacity, protocols, distributions, etc. So these also play a part in identifying the performance. Optionally, our customers also sometimes configure SNMP health monitoring that overall helps them to track the usage in terms of CPU or disk and all that stuff. Warranty is usually for 3 years. So again, it's best practice to keep in mind somebody should track the warranty and also replace hardware before the expiry of the warranty so that there is no gaps in support. So our sensors are configured for auto backup every day, 3 a.m. in the morning. It includes configurations and data, but it does not include recaps and logs. Optionally, customers sometimes save the backup on an external server if that's what their preferred way is. We have documentation to support that. And restore from backup can be performed either from the sensor GUI itself or via CLI. Both options are available. For basic troubleshooting, customers can take advantage of our official documentation. If the troubleshooting looks something like performing a health check or downloading the diagnostic logs or for forensic data and basic things like that, they can find the relevant steps on our troubleshooting documentation and the CLI guide. Other than that, they can submit a support ticket via Azure, and the severity and response times are these. If it's very critical, then somebody will be with you in less than an hour. And if the severity is minimum, then the response time is anytime between 1 to 8 hours. And it's almost always required to work with your CXE and keep your CXE in the loop so that they can help you with things like escalations if it comes to that. Operational health checks can be optionally automated. We have an out-of-the-box analytic rule that the customers can make use of via Sentinel, which is no traffic on sensor detected. So this is a good indicator of unhealthy sensor if there's no traffic being sent to Azure, right? So that analytic rule can be configured optionally, or customers also have the ability to make their own custom rules on Sentinel. For example, no alerts received in X hours or X days. Okay, so that was about troubleshooting. I know Jason gave a very detailed update on how to stay involved via communities, but I'm just going to quickly summarize what he already said. We have always public communities for customers and users to stay engaged with us, stay engaged with other customers, peers, share their knowledge, share their love for our product. We have so Microsoft has a community for all the security solutions and one community specifically for Defender for IoT, where we make announcements for general availability features. We talk about best practices. That's the location where this webinar is going to live after we're done with this session as well. We have a discussion space for Defender for IoT where you can, as a customer, directly engage with product and engineers and provide feedback, ask questions, use that for your learning and things like that. And for customers who would like to go a step ahead and sign an NDA with Microsoft, then they can take advantage of the private community channel. And that's where they can connect directly with the Defender for IoT team, try out our private features, previews, give us feedback, etc. All right, I would open it up for questions. Thank you so much for attending this session.
Awesome.
Over to you.
Thanks. We do have a few questions. The first one is, do you recommend the use of RSpan as part of configuring the switch so that you can aggregate data from multiple points on the network? Would there be traffic load issues?
We do recommend RSpan if that is the choice for the customer, if they choose to go that route. Traffic, so what was the second part of the question? Traffic load issues?
Yeah, would there be traffic load issues?
Typically, there wouldn't be. Ahi, have you seen that situation from your experience?
No, I think I also answered on the chat, but yeah, RSpan can be used. It all depends on how much load the switches can take, and then the sensor will take the load. Of course, you have to make sure you're using the right hardware profile that fits the amount of traffic you're expecting to get from the switch.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
The next question is, what is the recommended approach to enriching this with threat intelligence in Sentinel?
Okay, so same here. Our sensors are getting the threat intel updates on a monthly basis, and we are working. I mean, the threat intel is coming from a centralized location that all the Microsoft threat hunters are enriching these packages. So all the threats that are relevant for the line of products that we are monitoring and protecting are included. So you don't have to, update on both sides.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
The next question is, do you need to differentiate between the monitoring of north-south traffic versus east-west traffic?
Okay, great. So I answered that, and I will say it here. The more traffic that the sensor sees, the better identification and resolution that we get. So if you can provide the sensor with both networks or traffic directions, it's great. Of course, again, I will mention it. It's always important to make sure that the profile, the hardware profile that you're choosing, fits the amount of devices you're planning to discover, and also the amount, the size of the size of the bandwidth.
Great. The next question is, can we configure the sensor in HA environment?
Currently, this is not supported. It has only one management port that can be connected to one port on the switch.
Great. Then the next question is, when installing TLS certs, are these typically coming from an in-house CA or using publicly signed certs?
We are supporting both.
Either or. Yeah, either or.
Okay, great. The next question is, what is usually the content in threat intel that is gzipped into IoT?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
What is usually the content in threat intelligence that is gzipped into IoT?
First of all, it's not a gzip. It comes in a different format, but this is a part of our secret sauce. All the greatest and latest threats that are out there are being updated on the sensor. Signatures, malwares and stuff like that.
Great. Thank you. The next question is, when discovering devices, would it pick up firmware versions?
Yes, our goal is to give the customer full and deep visibility, including the firmware version. It, of course, matters of how much or how deep into the network the sensor can see. And of course, if it's supported by us, if it's a protocol that we are familiar with, and we are always looking for improvement. So if you install a sensor and we are not picking up the firmware version, we are happy to hear about it from you, either on the community or over a support ticket. And we will, keep improving and develop more protocols and look deeper into the product.
Great, thank you. The next question is the current sensor software still based on Ubuntu 18.04 LTS?
Yes, but not for much longer. Very, very soon, we are switching to Debian 11.
Great. That seems to be all the questions we've got. So with that, I would like to thank you, Vishakha, for being our guest today and for an excellent presentation. And thank you to the rest of the team who helped answer questions. At the same time, I would like to remind the listeners that the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements is to visit our landing page at aka.ms/securitycommunity. And while there, you'll find easy ways to navigate and find the resources and learning content relevant to our security products and their communities. A good start would be browsing our bite-sized product videos, ninja trainings, recordings of past webinars, GitHub communities, and more. We love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars. Please take a minute submitting your webinar feedback at aka.ms/security webinar feedback. Thank you and see you next time. Goodbye.